All right, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Madison Langseth, and I'm with the US Geological Survey. And today's session, we're going to be talking about tracking data metrics and citations. So the first half of the session, we're going to hear from some different organizations and what they are doing to track data metrics and citations. And then the second half, we're going to hear from the Make Data Count project about some of the work that they're doing on usage metrics. So first up, we have Jessica Hausman from Kodak and how they are tracking their data metrics. So come on up.
Thanks. So as Madison said, I'm at Kodak, and I'll get into that later. So basically, I'll go over Kodak and NASA USGS. If you saw my talk yesterday on citations, a little bit of this will be familiar, and how we do the DOI minting process, because that's important for gathering the metrics. Also how we're exposing our metrics at Kodak, and how we're kind of crawling that information. So first, what is PODAC? If you're not aware of the DAC system, PODAC is one of 12 DACs under the Earth Science Division of NASA. We distribute all of NASA's Earth Science data. So we have like Bob Downs here, he's part of CDAC, which is socioeconomic, PODAC is physical oceanography. So we all fall under the EOSDIS umbrella. And then under EOSDIS is ESDIS, which kind of helps, is kind of outside of the DACs, but helps kind of provide the guidance on how DACs should operate. So they're the ones who actually do the DOI registration for us. The individual DACs do the minting, provide the information to ESDIS, and they do the registration. Our DOIs are registered through DataSite, and here you can see all the fields that are gathered. The blue are the ones that actually get registered with the DOIs, and then these white ones are additional fields that ESDIS requests when we give them the DOI information, partially to help bulk up their own metadata for what the DACs are providing them. So at PODAC, we've actually did an exercise. So we have our own library at JPL. We're very fortunate that way. So we had the librarians there try to find metrics and citations of data that were PODAC used in various papers. It was over 500 citations that they came with, and this include not just like in the bibliography, but also in the acknowledgements, mentions in the methodology, like people would say we use the AVHRR data from PODAC. The problem is when you don't have a direct citation in the bibliography, it's really difficult to know for sure like what data was used. There were like a few PhD theses that they found as well, and they were written in Portuguese because they were from Brazil, and so that was interesting to try to see if they actually used our data or not. And so it was a very interesting exercise. It's very laborious, of course, and so we're like, this is not a long-term thing that we can sustain. And so Louis McGivney, who's in the back there, developed an API to basically, he goes and he scours Scopus, which is part of Elsevier, and grabs the metrics from there. And then we expose those metrics on our dataset landing pages. Because he's only scoping just Scopus, he didn't get nearly as many hits as what the librarians did, but his method takes 5 minutes, whereas the other way took, a couple weeks to do. So there's benefits in being efficient. So this is what our landing pages now look like, and this has all been updated within the past couple months. So if you visit PODAC regularly and you haven't been there and recently, this will be new. So this is our GRIST Muir sea surface temperature data set, and you can see here there's this little thing here saying 6 publications cited this data set. And you can also see we do have a citation tab here where you can get the direct citation along with the formatted citations in different languages too. And then when you click on that little 6 data sets cited, it actually will give you the references that the API grabbed. And then you can actually trace back on what works we're using the data. And then we also have our citations and acknowledgements to help guide people in the best way to cite our data. And of course, having the DOIs on our data sets now make it a whole lot easier because now there's a very structured way, a very formalized way to do this. And it's very machine readable too. And so Lewis has put his API up on GitHub, and he's also packaged it so you can grab it through Anaconda. So you can do a conda command and grab Kodak Pi, which is using our web services, and within Kodak Pi is the metric grabbing bot that looks at Scopus. So you can see Anaconda. So now, sorry, we're now gonna, it's a nice transition into like we just did data metrics, and now we're gonna look at what the software metrics are for the metrics API. So you can see Anaconda actually tells you how many downloads there are available. And then it's also, Lewis also put it in PyPy. So in PyPy, so this is the GitHub repository here. So, so you have all the badges like you typically get in GitHub. But now that it's in PyPy, you can actually query that. And this is just another screenshot to show you kind of that it is available there. But you have this query. You can now do queries. Can you see that, or is that? Oh, that's kind of small. Sorry about that. I will escape out of that, and I can just make the view bigger. There we go. It's a little bit better. Okay. So so this is the PyPy, and so you can go query PyPy for Kodak Pi, and then you can also tell it like what type of time interval you were interested in, and then you can also look, and then these are also the different fields it returns. So not only you're getting your download metrics, but you can also see like when it was downloaded, what country it's coming from, you know, and some basic information on who was downloading your data. So you can actually get more information now and trying to figure out who's getting the data, when did you get the data? Like if all of you, you know, were super interested in this after this meeting, we can look like, you know, within the week or two from now and see if there's been a big hit on this or not. And we would know it's from the ESIP meeting. And that is it. So, and so the next thing really is how are we going to do software? And so try to look at more than just Scopus to grab our data metrics and populate that on our the landing pages. And then also, how do we do the software metrics as well, I think is going to be another step we're going to do at Kodak. So do you have any questions? Okay. So, there we go.
Oh, okay. I saw a question go over here. There you go.
This is awesome. I'm hoping so for our types of data. A couple questions. First, and it's always easier to find what you find than to find what you didn't find. And it has happened at least once that data has been used without being cited.
Yes.
I wonder if you've explored, I noticed your data sets have rather specific acronyms. I don't remember what it was, but it was a unique enough acronym that perhaps Google or Google Scholar or something might find it. Have you ever done like an orthogonal search? You put in the acronym and find places where they say we used JPL's that data set and they didn't actually cite you.
Oh, so that was the exercise we did with the library, actually. So I think with the API Lewis has, I think it was like something around 60% of what he found is of what the librarians found. And that's because they were like, even if there was a mention of of grace, So this thesis in Brazil, they mentioned Grace data, and there is some allusions to JPL. So we knew like, okay, they got it from us, but they didn't. First of all, I can't read Portuguese, and it wasn't very clear. They didn't have anything in the reference section about using our data. It was in the methodology, and it was like, we used Grace data. And then there were a couple mentions of JPL, so we assumed they didn't get it because there is another data center in Germany for Grace data.
Yeah, that answers that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
But
the second one is, and pardon my ignorance, but is Scopus open, or do you have to have a subscription, or did you use your library's subscription?
I think we used our library subscription. Lewis can answer that.
So the nice thing about it is that Scopus provides a whole bunch of web services in order to do this. So it's very trivial. The code, as Jessica had mentioned, for this, if you would like to clone it and do something yourself, is under the Kodak Pi GitHub project. But essentially, you just need an API key. You don't need to pay to access the service. So it's free and open access. The reason that we picked Scopus in the first place is that apparently it's the world's largest citation database. Elsevier links into a number of other resources. I don't know exactly what the extent of that is, but it's significant. The nice thing about it as well is that the Web Services API provides the ability for you to query based on a temporal range. So you could say, give me citations for the last week, month, year, 5 years, or just give me all the citations. For example, you could query, we have run DOIs versus, if you can go back to the dataset landing page, Jessica. Mm-hmm. So Kodak currently best practices is for for anybody citing Kodak, is to utilize the DOI, which is published for the dataset. Not everybody does that. Some people will utilize the dataset landing page URL, which you can just see is at the very top there, but you can also see the DOI. And on the citation tab there, which this is just a screen grab, I believe, but on that citation tab, yeah, exactly. This shows exactly how it should be cited. And as you can see in the citation link here, we've got the dataset description version, where it was Kodak address, dataset access on date at DOI. Not everybody uses that. Some people use other bits and pieces, but you can query for these different fields within the Scopus database, so that it's very flexible. Very flexible.
My question is, does the app that Lewis has developed, does it do word searches, or is it only looking for DOIs?
No, it does the word searches too.
Word searches also.
Yeah, because I mean, basically whatever gets registered with the DOI.
Well, it's flexible. So you can do, for example, even wildcard searches. Say, for example, you're looking for NASA, you could look say you're looking for NASA Kodak, you could do any SA and then wildcard, like fuzzy search, and it would come up with everything NASA. Or you could do NASA, you can do DOI. There's a whole bunch of functionality that's in there. We're just talking about input parameters into like a typical query syntax for the REST API. So it's very flexible.
Are you looking at the whole document or only the citation section?
Good question. So that's also configurable as well. You can look at title, you can look at citations, you can look for the entire document. That's flexible as well.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Jessica. Okay, next up we have Bob Downs with CDAC. All right, take it away.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the socioeconomic data citations and impact. And first I want to, and I actually showed this slide before, when we had a webinar on data value last year. But I thought it was important to show here today the relationship between scientific value, which we might find in our data citations, and the relationship to socioeconomic value and societal value, and that I would consider that scientific value is certainly part of societal value and certainly overlaps with socioeconomic value. So I'm going to talk today about measuring the use of data and related objects, and I just want to make a caveat that there are other methods and others might talk about them besides data citations, and then talk a little bit about the value in terms of evidence of use, but there also are limitations associated with them. I'm also going to talk about the distribution of references and the value of that, and how they not only provide evidence of use, but they also facilitate analysis. So it's the top got cut off. So here I'm going to talk about data citations as measures of use. And there are similarities between data citations and citations of publications, in that they both provide evidence of intellectual contributions, and they identify where the cited work can be accessed to some extent, and they both offer credit. You know, in the case of publications, it will be authors, data producers for data, and publishers for articles, but it's often distributors for the data. But there are also a lot of differences with citations of publications in terms of citing data. And I really think I have a short list here. There's many more I think we can identify. You know, there's a long history of citing articles, and because of that, there are well-established norms for citing articles. And I think as a result of those norms, well, the motivations for articles aren't necessarily consistent if you cite an article, but I think they're quite different from the motivations associated with citing data. I guess one difference there also is if you're writing an article, more than likely you're going to have less citations of data, but I could actually see an article where you're citing lots of data in very few articles. Problem though is that the data citations often aren't recognized as intellectual contributions, and so they're not getting cited. And that lack of recognition also has downstream effects as well. And then the data are not usually distributed by the established publishers, so there's a little bit of a disconnect because of that tradition. You know, the publishers are all eager to recognize each other, and they might not be so eager to recognize a data center, for example, or even a data citation as a reference. And they're commonly not assessed as metrics when it comes to those promotions or hiring, for that matter. And the extent that the journal editor reviews the cited articles versus reviewing the cited data. And it might not be that the journal editors are even have the skills to do that. Often we look at journal publication boards, and we're trying to find people who have expertise in particular types of studies or disciplines, but are they really experts in the data from a variety of disciplines associated with the journal? So I think that's some of the aspects that could be improved as well. So there are lots of limitations of data citations. You know, there are many uses of the data are improperly cited, and I think the editorial boards need to do more work in that regard. And other types of data use are not necessarily reported in the literature either, such as commercial use, you know, might be proprietary information. And also the use of data might actually be the competitive advantage of an organization. So why should they be sharing that with their competitors? And can be the justification for government decisions are not necessarily always shared, you know, depending on a government and the particular agency involved. We often see data cited in textbooks, but when it comes to students' work where they might be citing the data, they are not necessarily published. And you don't see citations by the general public usually, and but we do see it reported in the mass media often, and we're glad to see that, because the implication there is if it's out there in the mass media, lots of people are going to be then using the data as a result of seeing them cited in the mass media. And the data citations do not necessarily provide complete metrics for data use. That is, there are other measures out there, and we'll probably hear more about some of them. So in terms of assessing use, we've done lots of studies ourselves, and I'm not going to be presenting on any of those studies here, but if you go out to the Researchers Art, you'll see some work from one of our studies there, and it's similar to some of the others. But in terms of assessing the extent of use, you can compare collections, you can observe the trends, or specific instances, how your data are currently being used. You can look at the increasing use, which might be an incentive to have other similar collections or data sets, or diminishing use, which might be a signal in terms of you know, how you might want to change the data that you're providing. And then in terms of different types of use, you know, it could be, you look at disciplinary versus interdisciplinary, or how the data are being cited with other data, co-citations, or how they're affecting science, education, commerce, policy, et cetera. We also had developed a taxonomy for one of our studies where you could look at how the data are actually used in a particular study. And it might be, for example, I don't want to run through all these, but in the first case, the data might be cited, but they might have just cited them mentioning that this is something they looked at but didn't use. And so that's the kind of thing we need to pay attention to. When providing access to publications that cite data is really important as well, because by making these publicly accessible, we're going to have online access to them. Ideally, we should have complete references and with links. Even if the publications or the articles are behind a firewall or a paywall, you might want to provide those links anyway. I know you're excluding some people, but if you're saying this is a database or these are the citations of our work, I think you want to be complete. And these can be organized in terms of being either associated with other data or in a searchable database, or you can feature a particular recent citations of your data. So the benefits are for users, they can understand how the data have been used by others. The producers can get credit, learn about how their data are being used. The distributors can be informed about can inform their collection development or the types of services they offer, and also get credit. And the sponsors can see the value of their investments, and publishers can identify appropriate uses of the data. So by providing access to publications that cite data, you can demonstrate the value of use, evidence, and show how the data are used in different kinds of studies and the methodologies being used, or other kinds of data that are being used with them. And this is an example of our CDEC Citations Database. So anybody can access it online and do analysis, various types of queries to look at publications by year, by publication type, looking at particular collections that we have, or looking at specific data sets. And so I just want to leave you with some recommendations. For data creators, decide early on who the authors are and on the intellectual property rights, and then deposit your data where the data will be cited, and they encourage people to cite the data. And for data curators and distributors to display their recommended data citations so people know how to cite the data, and then provide public access to the references that cited the data. For article publishers to verify that the published studies reference publicly accessible data and include a DOI with them. And for sponsors to support producers that deposit their data for public distribution, and to support the data distributors that encourage others to cite data. Anyway, thank you very much.
Questions for Bob?
So one of the conversations we're having with our data sets is, do we associate publications that were using the data prior to the formatting and publishing of the data as it is now, associated with that current iteration? And as we go through periodic updates, how do we continue to associate the prior publications with the new iteration of the data set? I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what that should look like.
Yeah, we have a lot of experience with that. So one of our collections, which is used a lot, is the gridded populations of the world. People often refer to it as GPW. And now we're in the 4th iteration of the series. It's really a series of collections. But originally, when people started citing that, so this has been going on since the mid-90s. And so a lot of the citations to GPW are, they're actually citing the fellow who came up with the methodology for making gridded population data, Waldo Tobler, and who since passed away just a few years ago. And so in those cases, they weren't citing our center. They were citing the article about the methodology, and that's certainly appropriate because then people will understand how those data are created, and it really serves as a source of documentation. But you know, ideally, what we, and I should say what we do on our website to encourage people to also cite the data center is for any of the data that we have on our landing page, we have a recommended data citation, and there we have the citation for the data at the repository. But if there's a seminal article, like the original article that the authors of the data wrote about the data, we'll offer that as an alternative recommended citation. And actually, we ideally would like is that they cite them both. Some authors or producers, when they give us the data, they actually say they want the citation to be to their original article. And so when negotiating with them, we say, yeah, we're going to put your article there as one of the recommended data citations. But ideally, we would like people to also cite our data center, because that's where they can get the data, and we do have DOIs with them, so that people will be sure to find them in the future. Thanks, that's a great question.
Other questions?
So your citations database, you went through it very quickly, so I probably didn't catch the details. Does it consist of citations for all the data products that you distribute that have been cited? It's a list of all the citations.
No, it actually doesn't. So data products that we no longer distribute are not in the citations database. So if we distributed a data set 20 years ago, but are no longer distributing that data set, we're not putting those citations in the database, because the way our database was designed, it's tied to the whole system of what we make available, all of the data sets. And so if it's not available, it's not in our citations database.
So if you're distributing a particular data set, from the data set, you'll be able to find all the citations that cited that, and vice versa?
You actually have to use our citations database to, if you want to search for a citation of a particular data set, and you can easily do that. But if you go to the data landing page for the data, you're not going to be just seeing a list of the data citations associated with that. We try to limit what's on a data landing page because they can get a bit busy. So our data landing pages just have the recommended citation, an abstract, and the title of the data set and the collection that it's in, of course, and then links to the metadata, documentation, related maps, and services, etc.
I'm trying to understand the distinction between the way you guys are handling it and Kodak is. The Kodak landing page said there are 6 citations for this database, and it was a clickable link. I'm assuming that if you click on that, you'll get the 6 citations. Yes, right.
Yeah, so if you click on that, it shows all the citations that were scoured, and then we include the DOIs if it's available for those. So then you can click back and get to those sources too. So.
Did you have a follow-up, Rama? So I have a question, Bob. So how do you build that citation database? Like, what are your sources?
Yeah, that's kind of an eclectic approach we have. And so on a weekly basis, we are getting alerts from the different bibliographic databases about data that are citing CDAC data, but we found it's necessary to supplement that, and so we're periodically doing Google searches and searching other kinds of databases where we're not getting alerts, so that we can make sure that we catch more of them. We also get from many data producers, they send us a little notice and say, my article's coming out and it cited your data. And so we're glad to see those as well.
Thanks. Any other questions? Is it working? Hi, Oceanographic. I have a question for, I guess, both of our speakers. In both cases, do either of your repositories have to deal with dynamic data, as, for example, streaming environmental sensor data? And in those cases, do you recommend in any way a DOI? I've seen some very general recommendations from RDA, and then in the ocean sciences domain, I just saw a really good new paper recommending citations for dynamic data.
but I wondered if either of you have use cases for dynamic data citation.
In our case, no, we don't. We're a little different from the other NASA data centers in that we don't get streaming data, but what we do is to integrate remote sensing data with other data products to create new data products that people can use to look at human factors, interactions in the environment.
So at Kodak, we do have most of our active data sets are the ones that have time continuations. So the data is appended to the time series as it comes in. So that just has one DOI. When there's a reprocessing where the whole record, historical record including, is reprocessed, then that gets a new DOI and it's considered a new version. We also have a couple data sets where there's smoothing done, especially like the level 4 type of data sets where it's combining multiple instruments. And because of the smoothing window, like the one I steward has like a 60-day smoothing window. So the historical side of it stays the same, but the forward stream tends to change. So whenever we get an update quarterly, is it possible that the last month of the data might change because of that smoothing window? So we've had, but we don't give it a DOI because the algorithms have stayed the same with that. Plus, it's difficult to do dynamic DOIs as well. And so there's not really a good system for that. Ideally, if something is, I think if you're going forward stream and you're just depending, I think that's fine. But if anything else changes in that, ideally you would want to assign a new DOI, but it gets hard because our users would get, and I would get confused too, like which DOI is this data set again? And so basically we consider as long as the algorithm stays the same, we don't change the DOI or the version. It's the same data set.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we should probably move on for the sake of time. And then if there's time at the end, we can come back.
Mike Daniels from NCAR. So I'm not saying we have all the answers to the dynamic data citations, but the CORDS project from EarthCube has worked with Unidata to come up with a template for continuously streaming time series data that I'd like to work with others on as well.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Okay, next I'd like to introduce myself. Let's see if I can get out of this. All right. There we go. Okay, so again, I'm Madison Langseth. Oh dear, we want to. Can we just mirror it?
It's like a little trick, but if you start the screen share after, then it should work.
Because I don't need the presenter view.
Let's see. Slideshow.
How many people does it take to set up a slideshow?
You just want to be able to see the notes.
No, I don't need to be able to see the notes.
So what's
we can just mirror it.
There is no screen view here. What's going on? We're just not sharing. You're good. Accept.
So can we just?
Oh, that's the problem. Okay.
Nope, but now it's showing.
It's still showing.
We just want to mirror it.
Right. All right, we're good now. Hold on.
No.
If we flip it now, if we flip it now. Guys. Good now. Is that okay? Can you do it like that? Can you do it from there?
That should be fine. Does that look okay? Okay, perfect. All right, let's get going then. So today I'll be talking about our approach to automating citation tracking at the USGS. And we have kind of most of this working, but it hasn't been kind of 100% operationalized yet. Okay, so first I'll briefly say a word about my organization within USGS. So I work for the Science Data Management branch, and our mission is to optimize and share USGS data management practices and workflows to ensure that our science data are fully described, preserved, and publicly accessible. And so we do this in 3 ways: by building communities to solve data-related challenges, by promoting best practices through educational webinars and the data management website, and by developing enterprise data management tools, 2 of which I'll be talking about today: Sciencebase and the DOI creation tool. Okay, so Sciencebase is a trusted digital repository for USGS data releases. It's capable of storing data and metadata, and it has an API for interacting with it programmatically, as well as being integrated with the USGS DOI creation tool for minting DOIs with the 10.5066 prefix. Okay, so as managers of Sciencebase, we want to be able to track data citations in order to provide data originators and data users with information about where data are being used in the published literature. But right away, we ran into some challenges. So we reached out to some of our colleagues who we knew had been tracking data citations for many years, and they still had a fairly labor-intensive approach to their tracking, similar to what Jessica was describing that they did initially. And we couldn't replicate that due to extremely limited resources. So that was challenge number 1. Another challenge is we figured that publishers should know this information, at least when authors are including data citations in their works cited. But publishers aren't always sharing that information in an easily accessible format, although now maybe with the Kodak Pi tool, maybe they are. So we'll have to check that out as well. And then kind of the third challenge is that authors aren't always providing formal citations to data in their publications. Okay, so we sat down and we brainstormed the sources that we knew had some information about the links between data and manuscripts. So the 3 that we knew about were USGS Publications Warehouse, Crossref Event Data, and GeoDeepDive. Okay, so first, the USGS Publications Warehouse is a catalog of metadata for all USGS internal and external manuscripts. And each manuscript has a landing page that lists the data that were used to support the conclusions in that paper. And an important thing to note is that this data release information comes from our USGS internal review tracking system, not the manuscript itself. So I've actually found that authors don't always include like the dataset DOI in the manuscript itself. And sometimes they'll just include a brief statement listing the repository where the data can be found. So something that we need to work on internally at USGS. But that being said, so the USGS Publications Warehouse does have an API so that we can easily grab all of these data release links and then determine which ones link to data in our Sciencebase repository. Okay, so next is the Crossref event data, which is another service, and I don't know a ton about it, even though I'm using it. So I'll just put that out there. But basically, when a publication with a Crossref DOI references a dataset DOI or a data site DOI, it keeps track of that. It's a pretty great service, but it relies on, I think, publishers to provide that information and for authors to actually be including data citations in their manuscripts. So we did kind of use this a little bit. We searched for events where a Crossref DOI references a data site DOI with our USGS 10.5066 prefix, and we came up with 99 events. Okay, so we didn't think that was like super great. We were hoping that more people had cited our data than just 99. So next, we started exploring Geo Deep Dive, or now it's known as XDD. And Geo Deep Dive negotiates agreements with publishers that allow programmatic downloading and mining of published content. And currently there are over 10 million documents in Geo Deep Dive, so fairly extensive. So we are able to mine the full text of articles for references to DOIs with the 10.5066 prefix. And Geo Deep Dive will return articles with those hits, as well as a snippet of information around that mention to provide a little context so we can see, is this actually a DOI or a reference to some data? And then using this method, we found a little over 800 references using Geo Deep Dive. So a little bit better than what we found with the Crossref event data. So now that we know about links between Crossref DOIs and our own data site DOIs, for relationships where a data site DOI is explicitly cited in a publication and discovered through either the Crossref event data or through Geo Deep Dive, we're actually adding information about the related identifiers to our own data site DOI's metadata using our DOI creation tool that the USGS manages. Then so using the information from all three of those methods, from the USGS Publications Warehouse, the Crossref event data, and Geo Deep Dive, we can automatically then add new external publications that cite a given data product to the display page for data in ScienceBase. So this helps present the story of how and where data products are being used by other researchers moving forward through time. So this is an example of one of our landing pages, and at the bottom we just have a kind of section where we display the related external resources and provide a link to those publications. I think it's really cool what Kodak does to like simplify the landing page, just have the link. We're not doing that yet, but maybe in the future that would be something good to implement. Okay, so using these various APIs, we've written some Python scripts to kind of semi-automate this tracking process. And our goal is, once we're confident in the process, to convert those scripts into cron jobs that can run on a regular basis. So using Deep Dive, we don't have to rely on publishers to provide the citation information to us. We can mine the text of the articles ourselves. And then finally, as long as authors include the DOI for data, the data that they're using, at least somewhere in their manuscript text, we should be able to capture that reference. I still don't think that 100% of authors are doing this. Like I said, some just kind of make a reference to the repository. So we still need to continue to educate researchers and promote data citation. And then another thing just that I'm hoping to do, I kind of have dabbled in it a little bit, is kind of doing searches for ScienceBase, or like the term ScienceBase in Geo Deep Dive. Of course, ScienceBase is not super unique, so that's, you know, a little challenging, but something just I'm trying to do for fun. But with that, I would like to take any questions that you guys have. Any questions? Okay, if not, then we can move on to our next presentation. Okay, so next up we have Amber Budden and Matt Jones. And they're going to talk a little bit about the Make Data Count project.
Okay, thanks so much. So we have 2 10-minute talks, but we've put them back to back with the intention of kind of having a continuous talk because they're highly related. And so I'm going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about tracking and exposing data usage metrics. I'm going to talk about the Make Data Count project and the rationale behind the project and what has been done as part of that project. And then Matt's going to go on to give an example of implementation and discuss implementation in the context of Data One. Although Matt and I are up here, the other person on this award that is affiliated with Data One is Dave Vigleas. And so the 3 of us are all here representing Data One. But Data One was one of a few partners that were part of this Alfred Sloan funded project, the others being DataCite and California Digital Library. So really the kind of first work on Make Data Count came back in 2014, where we were interested in exploring the pilot capacity for looking at data level metrics. And so the first thing that we did was we went out into the community as part of that NSF award to understand what it is that the community values when thinking about usage metrics for data. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the community's experience with scholarly publishing and citations, citations came out as one of the highest valued things. So researchers were interested in knowing about how their data was cited. Also important was downloading of the data. Presumably to be able to understand the data and use the data, you have to have downloaded it first. And of lesser importance to the community were views. And so kind of in the ordering, views less important than downloads, less important than citations, was consistent with previous work that had been done. We also asked about other types of alt metrics, social media coverage, etc., and those just weren't really ranked very highly. So for the purposes of the Make Data Count project, we focused on views, downloads, and citations. And so this project, as I mentioned, was funded by Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to Data One, DataCite, and California Digital Library. And I do recommend you go and take a look at the URL. There's lots of resources and information on the project and documentation for how to implement. So this was kind of our roadmap for the activities. You can see at the top there, we talk about data citations, and in the middle, we are talking about usage metrics, and then we have this kind of future fuzzy metrics, social media, other avenues of potential exploration in the future, and that wasn't a target, as I mentioned, for the project. Kind of stepping through our roadmap, I'm going to be focusing first on standardizing usage metrics. And so what this involved was developing recommendations in collaboration with Counter. And that would inform the way in which repositories process their usage metrics and deliver them to the metrics hub, which I will talk about in a moment. So working with Counter, we developed a code of practice for research data. So this is now published on the Counter website. It was written by members of the DataCite, the Make Data Count team from Data One, DataCite, and CDL in collaboration with Counter. And really what this is doing is providing a set of community standards or recommendations for how we go about counting things, counting our views, counting our metrics, and defining the terms associated with those, with the idea that if the community is adopting the standard, we're all counting the things in the same way. We're not getting apples and oranges when it comes to looking at usage metrics on various platforms. They've been standardized against this community standard. So here are some of the definitions that are enclosed within that code of practice. And I'm not going to go into detail with the code of practice, but obviously if this is something that if you're actively collecting usage metrics, we strongly recommend you take a look at this and you look at your infrastructure against the code of practice and you align it. They have definitions for data set. Okay. Okie doke. Sorry. That would be why. Okay. All right. Hang on. Okay. Sorry to the remote audience that it took so long for us to figure that out. Okay, is that good? Okay, all right. So within the code of practice, a data set is an aggregation of data published or curated by an agent available for access or download. A component is part of that data set, also available for access or download. A collection is a curated set of data sets, a curated aggregation of data sets, and versioning represents changes that have occurred to those elements. For the purposes of the language that I've been using thus far, views and downloads, Counter actually uses slightly different language. Investigations is the terminology that is used in Counter, and this refers to access to a data set or information about that data set. So access to a data set is kind of similar to thinking about downloads, and looking at information related to the data set is akin to views. So in the Counter code of practice, investigations is downloads and views, and requests are user access to a data set, so downloads. So if you wanted to get views, you would take investigations minus requests. So the language is slightly different, but that's kind of how it translates to the language that we commonly use in this community. So once a repository have implemented the Counter standards against the way in which they collect usage metrics, they report those to the server log processing, and this goes into the data metrics hub. And I should mention here that if your repository is part of the Data One network and you're providing information to us, we go about submitting that information for you and doing the log processing to account for any replication that exists across the network. Now, as you can see in our original roadmap, we indicated that we were going to develop a new data level metrics hub. In fact, we ended up leveraging event data, which is the collaborative service that's provided by DataCite and Crossref, which we heard a little bit about a moment ago, and Matt will go into a bit more detail. And then finally, when we have these standardized, consistent numbers for usage metrics, then individual repositories or organizations like Data One can go about displaying these metrics. And so what this means is in the display that the citations have been standardized, the views have been standardized, the downloads have been standardized. And so if I'm looking at metrics at repository A versus repository C, if they're part of this Make Data Count implementation framework, then those are going to be the same numbers that I'm looking at across the system. And so right now, the organizations that have adopted the code of practice and are implementing this in the metrics that they display are Dataverse, Zenodo, Caltech most recently, Dryad, and Data One. And Matt is going to talk specifically about Data One in a moment. And so I just want to revisit this citation piece, and I'm going to be echoing some of the recommendations or the challenges, in fact, that came out of Madison's talk. Right now, we have a data citation problem in the sense that we don't really have them. We have a challenge that authors don't always cite data objects, and when they do, they don't do so in a standardized fashion. And even when they're cited in a standardized fashion and they're using unique identifiers, sometimes those aren't being reported or picked up by the publishers and reported to event data. And so an author can go about the work of including an appropriate citation, but that information is still not being submitted to event data. So it means that we don't have accurate information on citations. And so really, this is kind of a call to action within the community to help us make data count. I mean, firstly, we're asking repositories to process logs against the code of practice so that we have these comparable views and downloads. And we're asking them to submit those standardized logs to event data so that we can have this aggregation and the transparency. We want everybody to be displaying comparable views, downloads, and citations so that the data author community and others have a standardized and appropriate view of the usage of those data. As I mentioned, we're encouraging publishers to share data identifiers and a community call for always using standard identifiers when citing data. And with that, unless there's any questions about the Make Data Count project itself, we're going to go into an example of implementation at Data One. Okay, Matt.
So I'm going to pick up from where Amber left off and talk about basically being able to utilize the information that's being reported to event data in this Crossref event service. It was great to see Meredith's talk where she was both consuming data from the event data service, but also publishing data to the event data service. This is, I think, a little known aspect of the fact that event data is a collaboration between Crossref and DataCite. And this is one of the only open collections of basically publication to dataset links and other types of links among DOIs that's out there. And so the API is openly accessible for querying, but anybody who's issuing DOIs through either Crossref or through DataCite also can do exactly what Meredith showed. And when you have mined resources and other things for those citations, repositories can report those back to event data just as much as a publisher can. And so that call to action to, both have publishers properly cite data sets and report them, I think goes for repositories as well. It's really, as a community, if we could all start populating an open source that we can utilize, then we can also build upon all the sort of data mining and text mining that we're doing in different communities, or even the manual accumulation of citations that we're keeping track of at the repository level. So if we do that and we start accessing the event data API, it really makes for some powerful and comparable capability. So I wanted to give a couple examples of using the event data API to get citation information out that might be of use. So this first one is a quick show of a call to the event data API that was implemented by the folks at CDL on their Dash platform that's going to be part of the new Dryad rollout. And in this particular API call, they're just asking for all of the citations associated with a particular DOI. In this case, they can use that to convert that into a set of citations, in this case 0, but also the number of views and downloads for that API, for that particular data set. So unlike, say, Scopus or something else, event data is focusing on not just citations, but also other standardized metrics out of the counter code of practice. So you can also do things like combine more, like follow some of the linkages that are present in the metadata. So we, in addition to asking for an individual data set, we can say, what are all of the identifiers associated with a data center? In this case, the DOI or the data center identifier used in DataCite for a data center, and then link that to their data sets, and then link that to all of their usage and citation counts. And by doing that, you can basically access everything for a particular data center. We can also look at, say, funders. So Crossref and DataCite are tracking funding information associated with these different products. So you can use, for example, a Crossref or a funder identifier that links to the DataCite dataset identifiers, and then in turn can link to citations. And so we can do a query like the one below that ANDs together several conditions and gets for all of the, in this case, the European Commission data sets, we can find out how many times those have been cited in scholarly articles. And so it's a really nice, powerful system for slicing and dicing citations in different groups. So I'm going to, oh, actually, there's another example here, which is also using the same system to look at individual researchers. So using the ORCID identifier for a researcher, link that over to the DataCite identifiers for data sets, and then get out of that usage and citation counts. So I'm going to show some examples of how we've utilized this API within Data One to produce some nice user interfaces. They have some similarities to the ones that Jessica, Meredith, and have presented. One of the nice things about it, I think, is that because we're using this community hub for the metrics, when we display citation counts on Data One, they should be the same as the citation counts that are being displayed, say, on the DataCite landing page for that same DOI, or in any other aggregator's view of that source. So another benefit of us all reporting to and sharing usage metrics and counts is that the many places where a data set might show up through various aggregators, whether that's Google Dataset Search or Data One or someplace else, they would all have those same metrics and impact reporting going on. So this is a results search for in Data One, basically shows the number of citations here, 2,500 downloads and 279 views for this first data set by Hi-O Aiken on some Arctic data. And then if you drill into the landing page for that, we basically are able to display those same citations, downloads, and views for each data set. So this has a lot of similarities to what we've seen come before. But because the Event Data API slices data not just overall, but also by month, time period, by spatial location of the requester and other aspects like that, we can start building things like time series graphs. So in this case, we're showing the time series graph of the downloads for this particular data set over the multiple years from 2013 to 2019. And you can drill into a monthly level and see how many times things are being accessed and whether there's correlations between, say, the downloads of a data set and the release of a paper or some other event like that. And so it's really useful to be able to do that for downloads. You can do the same thing for views. And of course, you can also get the linkages to the direct citations that occurred for this paper. So in this case, there's one citation for this particular data set. We have the citation metadata here, and then you can click through it to jump directly to the paper that's associated with that and get that direct linkage set up. And so I think this is a really powerful system because of the consistency that it provides in display for groups like us, where we're trying to aggregate information from multiple different providers. So I want to talk a little bit more about going beyond the data set level and talk about aggregated metrics. In addition to being able to look at impact and metrics of individual data sets, we want to be able to produce reports that are useful to repositories that are part of the network, to individual researchers that want to see their impact across their data sets, to funders and other types of groups. And so with this API, we're also able to build these sort of aggregated views. So we can have like a landing page for one of the repositories, the Arctic Data Center, and accumulate all of the citations that are associated with that data center and show them on one page. So in this case, I'm showing the shockingly low number 8 of citations to the Arctic Data Center data sets. This is because of that problem that Meredith raised, which is that there's not very good reporting to event data and to Crossref yet of those linkages between citations. And so we're sort of on a mission to try to get people to, both on the publisher side and on the repository side, to be back reporting back to this common hub all of those citations that are out there. We can also do the same type of time series view and show that across all of the data sets for this data center, this is what the sort of time series of views looks like, and this is what the time series of downloads looks like. And so there's been a little over 16 million downloads of data sets across all data sets in the Arctic Data Center since about the mid 2013. One of the nice things about this visualization, you can see that there's this huge spike there in the middle, and that makes it hard to sometimes see the dynamics of the data. So this visualization is scalable, and you can change the time slider on it. And as you zoom into that visualization, you can look at particular regions and see the dynamics when things are bumping along, even if there is like 1 month where there's a huge spike in activity. We can also do this for individual people. So we can take for one of our researchers, like in this case, Jeanette Clark, who works at NCS where we are. She's been involved with creating a lot of data sets. She has 65 data sets, and those data sets have been downloaded 36,000 times. We can show the time series for her. And so she can track impact of what is happening, both from a citation and a download and a view perspective on her particular slice of the overall Data One network. So our plan, in addition to these repository and researcher profiles, we're basically building out a set of portals. We can display these kinds of aggregated metrics for groups and lab groups, for grants, for funders, and each of these different types of aggregated views will be part of the Data One portal system that we're rolling out this year. So I think I'll just leave you with sort of the plea that we all work together to try to improve consistency among our reporting of metrics and try to use these shared services like the Crossref and Event Data Service, because it really helps with consistency in the community. And as repositories, I think it would be really fantastic to do what Meredith showed and report any citations that you find back to the shared community service. It's a really valuable thing. So with that, thank you.
All right.
So this is really neat stuff. Just have a question on the mechanics of aggregations. So do you assume that if you want to aggregate for a particular repository, for example, you assume that the citations include the name of the name of the repository, so you're able to aggregate, or do you use some other method?
No, we don't. We're not basing that on name matches. We're basing that we have for each of the repositories in the Data One network, we know which data sets are associated with that repository because of the other metadata parsing we're doing. So we're already building a large cross-repository index and cross-indexing that. We're also doing that for the individuals that are contributing to those repositories. So we've already got that all built into a searchable public API. And then we're just adding on to that, linking to that the citation information. So we're not doing any special parsing for that.
So it's like a scripted search.
It's like a what?
Is it like a scripted search that covers that set of?
It's actually that when people are reporting data sets to us, we're basically looking at the metadata that they're already providing, and we're indexing which repositories those things come from. So we don't have to guess because they're reporting that as part of the when they're being harvested and added into the Data One sort of system.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So that's a service you're providing through Data One. So we wouldn't be able to aggregate those metrics going through the event data.
You can aggregate metrics through event data, but at a slightly different grain. I showed several API calls at the beginning of aggregations. For the repository level, the way that event data allows you to do aggregations is using their data center identifier, which is really tied to DOI prefixes. Many repositories have multiple DOI prefixes, and those will basically be separate groups within the data site service, whereas Data One can aggregate those together. So yeah, we do provide a lot of value added stuff on top of the Crossref event service. We also do a lot of caching, and so we cross correlate the metadata corpus we're getting from repositories with this citation information and allow you to slice and dice things in different ways than you can from just the event data service, but a lot of it is possible there too.
Cool.
I had almost the identical question. One thing tangential to that question, Matt, does it matter and is it recorded whether the person citing a data set found that data set through Data One or found it through its original member node?
In our usage and reporting metrics in Data One, we ask each of the members of the network to report how many people have accessed data objects from their system. They report that up to us, and then we aggregate those. If people are viewing data sets on Data One and then clicking through to a download on the member repository, we're going to see one event on Data One that represents the view, and then we're going to see one event coming from the repository that represents the download. And so that's why aggregating them together is important, because we see both the views that are happening across different aggregators or different, like if there's multiple replicas of the same data set, we can catch where somebody's accessing from. So we do have that information. Right now, we're just adding it all together and showing it as one lump sum, but that it is actually, you can break that down within our reporting system.
I guess I meant to get at, does Data One or other such aggregators, do they need recognition, accolade for having been the source of discovery? Or, in the citation, there's that accessed from this URL on this date. Is that of importance that to give, kudos to Data One?
I mean, yeah, so Data One does have a challenge as an aggregator trying to sort of, because we pass through requests to repositories to directly access the data, it's not always clear that something happened, with our facilitation. Dave and one of our interns did a bunch of work trying to look at our search logs and be able to trace the relationship between a search session and browse session through Data One through to the download request that happened on the, and it's a challenging thing to do, and we're trying to figure out how we can trace those events. Right now, I think it's pretty opaque. I mean, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Dave, but We could definitely use credit when we help facilitate that, and I don't really know how to do it well at this point. But
I'm afraid I have to repeat two questions here that now in a different context, and that is, we obviously have data in our repository that have been used for publications long before either the data got a DOI or any idea of data citation came along. It could be possible to link this up. Is this something that should be reported or not? And then the next question is, since we have long-term data, the DOI changes every so often for the same data set because it changes. So are then the publications that have been based on this data set with an older DOI, are they going to be lost? Are they going to be continued to be linked to this data set some way or another with 5 different DOIs?
yeah.
So how do we go about reporting it? So you were calling for repositories to work together to put the data into this database. Are they appropriate if they go back before any kind of DOI, any kind of citation? Should we even link a publication that says, oh, well, yeah, we got the data from NTL LTR?
Yeah, so so there's a lot there in your questions. The first thing, can you link to older things that came out before a data set had a DOI? Absolutely. We talked a lot about versioning within the counter code of practice and how we handle versioning and stuff like that. And we agreed at the time that when data changes through the sort of courses of an identifier, we should really be aggregating both usage and citation metrics to all those versions that are associated. So if you read counter, you'll see that it says basically include all of the views, accesses, and downloads and citations for all of the versions of this particular identifier. So I think within, say, maybe the first version of your data set, it might include a bunch of older historical accesses to that from previous versions. When you have different identifiers for multiple versions of a data set, like you have, say, 2 DOIs that were issued and they're related, within Crossref, you'll see that as separate lists of citations and downloads and counts. But within Data 1, one of the value-added things we're doing is we're looking at the metadata telling us about the version history between the different identifiers. And we know that one DOI is a replacement for another DOI, and we're automatically aggregating those together and showing you the total across all the versions of that data set. We've also been debating about whether we should do version-specific subsets if people wanted to, but right now we're already aggregating up. As long as you're reporting your version history among your identifiers in Data 1, then that's actually happening for you. And I forgot the third part of your question. Do you remember?
I think it was mostly how to report the linkages between a data set and a publication if the data have not been officially cited. Just sort of, I mean, I know which data set was used. Should that be reported or not?
So in the event data service, you report citations through this relationships link. So it's a link between 2 identifiers saying that they had a relationship, and there are different relationship types you can use. So cited and cited by is one set of relationships. Derived and derived from is another set of relationships. If you know that referenced, used, there are a bunch of different relationships as well. 25 or 30 relationships that you could utilize. And many of those are different types of citation. And so right now there's a list, Martin Fenner has a list of about 16 of those relationship types that are being, quote, counted as citations, even if they aren't necessarily directly in the text of the thing. If a data set was used in a paper, you can express that in this relationship metadata.
Question for you. So if we're reporting in the data site metadata that a DOI is related to a Crossref DOI, are data site and Crossref communicating? So like, will that end up getting picked up by Crossref and then kind of showing in the Crossref metadata that it is related to this data site DOI?
Yeah, absolutely. The Crossref data site event data service is a partnership between the two organizations. They each are running an API endpoint that you can query, but they're exchanging data and metadata. So when you report, say, to Crossref DOIs that you've done something, they're sharing that with DataSite. And when you report to DataSite about those DOIs, they're sharing that with Crossref. And so when you query either API, probably with a little lag, but you're getting the full data set from both of them. And that came out of a community group work on the Scholix project through RDA. And so they are definitely working together and trying to make sure that that open collection of citation metadata is very consistent.
Okay, so eventually our 800 references that we found and are putting into our data site metadata would end up, like, I would end up seeing that I do my Crossref event data search.
Absolutely, it should be pretty quick.
Okay, cool.
I mean.
All right, awesome.
Doug Schuster from NCAR. This has been an interesting discussion, and we're trying to attack this problem as well. And we're basically using the event data that you've highlighted. And I just wanted to point out for some of the services, such as the Elsevier service, I asked our library how much that is, and they said it's in the 5 figures to purchase that. And then there's a Thomson Reuters service that's somewhat similar. So it's very expensive if you want to use those publisher-based services. So I just wanted to put that out there. That might be a good solution, but it's also costly.
So that's also the experience that we had. So that's why we ended up going with Geo Deep Dive to kind of mine the text.
I'd like to also mention that right now, publishers are not really registering a lot of their data set citations with the event data service, but they are registering their publication cross-references. And that's because they kind of have control over that space. There's been a lot of discussion in the scholarly publications community about how we can, as a community, put some pressure on the publishers to do a better job at reporting to the open APIs that they have these citation linkages that are not there right now. And so I think if we all make some noise, in theory, as members of Crossref, most of those publishers are obligated to publish that linking information, and they're not. But it's because they don't feel enough pressure to do so. So they want you to buy their service. Exactly, they want you to buy that citation service. Yep.
Any other questions?
So I have a question for people in the audience. For those of you that are involved in repositories that display usage metrics, how many of you, or maybe just a general raise of hands regardless, were aware of the counter code of practice for research data?
Is it appealing to any of you to look into implementing usage metrics beyond citations and following a standard like that, or does that seem like too much work?
So I'll say I'm not in charge of that aspect of the repository for Sciencebase, but I can kind of report on some conversations, I guess, that have been had. So we invested a lot of kind of resources into doing some usage metrics many years ago. And so I think there's like the feeling like, well, we don't really want to invest the resources again right now to upgrade to the counter code of practice. So so that's where we are right now.
Yeah, so our first stage of the funding that we had from NSF for the project, we termed it making data count. Then with the Sloan funding, it was make data count. And we are looking at moving forward with a more extensive implementation process. And so collaborating with the community for the implementation. And so hopefully by the time we get to the end of that, we'll have made data count, but we're getting there.
Any final questions or comments from the room, or I guess online? Or do we have anybody online? All right, we got one more in the back.
Will these kind of protocols ever expand beyond just publications and data sets to something like, say, physical samples, where you have persistent identifiers that are located in the documents, but you also potentially would have a lot more records to deal with?
So in principle, there's no reason that this whole system can't be used for other types. Right now, we had intended for under Make Data Count to have the event data service support multiple types of identifiers, including ARCs and other types of resolvable identifiers beyond DOIs. But that has proved to be challenging. I think there is a growing recognition that there's a need to support multiple different identifier types, including IGSNs and RRIDs, both of which are used extensively for samples. And as I think if the community is interested in being able to track metrics associated with those, this kind of system could do so if we support those multiple identifier types. Obviously, there are scaling issues that would probably have to be dealt with practically speaking, but there's nothing about this that's specific to data sets and publications. You could link software, you can link samples, you can link other parts of the research infrastructure. I think the major challenge is making sure we're supporting all of the identifier types that are in use in those other areas.
So at least in terms of articles, we had been using the ISI Web of Knowledge, and then we supplemented it with Google Scholar. And no one said anything about Google Scholar. I was just wondering whether you've had any experience or recommendations regarding that.
So Google Scholar has a explicit no harvesting policy. So it's against their terms of service to harvest their data. So we haven't put up a system to do that because I think it has a tremendous amount. It would be wonderful to see Google Scholar publish an API that we could access stuff from. They have not seemed to want to go down that path over the years, even though I think there's been a tremendous community call for them to do so. So I'm not quite sure why that is. But we in the first version of Make Data Count, we wrote, Martin Fenner at DataCite wrote a program called Legato, which does a lot of what Meredith was showing with GeoDeepDive, basically trying to build a system to do text mining and mining of multiple APIs to extract this kind of citation information. And although it was successful, what we found was we ended up running into licensing term problems with many of the sources. So we ultimately decided that trying to force, beyond the open literature, like the PLOSs of the world, like trying to get into the proprietary literature and find these citations is actually really hard and expensive. And so we kind of left off on that and went for, can we get people to report to an open database as opposed to us trying to extract from a bunch of proprietary text databases.
Okay. With that, we will end. I would like to thank everybody that presented today, as well as all of you for participating in this discussion. So thank you very much.